This video wasn't really easy to make, and oh boy, it involved a lot of research, but I'm so pleased that I got it done. And this was mind-blowing to think that this had happened, and although it never has been touched until this point, especially since it's head to Titanic month, but I will not get into it because I know that you might want to watch the video without a long introduction. So until then, I hope it is very important that it is worth sharing. Enjoy. Following the Titanic disaster, questions were asked involving the lifeboats, but a conclusion hadn't been reached to determine why one important lifeboat drill had been cancelled on the morning of Sunday the 14th of April 1912, 12 hours before the Titanic collided with an iceberg which caused her to sink 2.5 miles below the surface. While the conclusion hadn't been looked into, there have been a series of other conflicting evidence, including the responsibility from the victory crew, who were unable to attend to the large amount of third-class passengers they had to serve, and this meant that not all their meals would have been ready in time. However, the most accepted reason was Captain Edward J. Smith cancelling the lifeboat drill for the crew members because it would disrupt the religious services. This is based on a testimony from Stewart George Crowe, who mentioned this in the US inquiry, but he gave no explanation for this. It is because of this information that Crowe's testimony has been accepted, and it has been repeated in every Titanic documentary. However, because there was no explanation, it is possible that it could be a case of Chinese whispers, where information gets misinterpreted and spreads around. Now, on History Inside a Nutshell, new evidence has come to light to prove that once and for all, the myth of the cancelled lifeboat drill can be debunked. But before we dive into the answer, we have to look back to the beginning and what the lifeboat drills were like before the Titanic's demise. In 1912, there had been a series of drills which had taken place in Belfast and Southampton while she wasn't in service. However, there have been other drills that would occur while the Titanic was at sea. These would include emergency, fire and muster lifeboat drills, and they would have occurred every day in the evenings and on Sunday morning in port and out in the open sea. This was standard practice for crew members at the time and is legally required for the drills to take place under Article 18 of the Ship's Rules and Uniform Regulations issued by the International Mercantile Marine Company. According to the article, it stated that
every Sunday at sea, the passengers having been advised beforehand to prevent alarm, the crews of each boat are to be mustered at their boat stations at noon, weather permitting, the chief officer reporting a supply of water and biscuits in each boat, and the carpenter reporting the davits and screw lashings in working order.
When she was in Belfast on the 25th of March 1912, a drill had taken place where the life-saving equipment was tested. Although the collapsible lifeboats weren't launched, all of the 16 lifeboats under the davits were lowered into the waters of the River Lagan. This was done to test the strength and the operation of the Welland davits handling the gear, while in each lifeboat, groups of islandsmen working for the Harland and Wolff shipyard were seated. This drill was conducted in the presence of Francis Carruthers, an engineer and ship surveyor for the Board of Trade. Later on, Charles Lightoller would go on to testify about the loading in one of the lifeboats, and it is possible that because of fear of the mechanism collapsing, Lightoller believed that filling the boats to capacity would have been impossible. Although Lightoller wasn't present at the drill, we aren't sure the maximum number of islandsmen who participated, despite each boat filling to capacity. However, the Titanic's regular lifeboats passed a seaworthiness test. On the 2nd of April, Carruthers would be present at the Titanic sea trials when he would examine the many tests the ship would have to perform to see if she was eligible to be taken out to the open sea. Alongside Carruthers would be a handful of Titanic's senior and junior officers who arrived in Belfast on the 27th of March. One senior officer who arrived that day was then First Officer Charles Lightoller. From his testimony in the US inquiry, Lightoller would describe what happened to the lifeboats during the sea trials.
Tell just what was done.
The boats on the ship were swung out, and those that I required were lowered down as far as I wanted them. Some all the way down, and some dropped into the water.
I wish you get the proportion that went into the water.
About 6.
And the others lowered?
And the others lowered part of the way, as far as I thought necessary.
From the way it went, the drill was prepared and Carruthers was satisfied with the final result, writing in his report,
I have inspected the boats and their equipment and have seen 16 swung out and lowered into the water. The lifeboats are in order and conveniently placed.
At the end of the trials, the Titanic passed with flying colours. As a result, the Titanic was given a Board of Trade certificate called an Agreement and Account of Voyages and Crew. Once signed, the certificate would make the Titanic valid for a year before having to go through the trials again on the 1st of April 1913. Interestingly, this isn't the only method that was used in a lifeboat drill at the time of the Titanic. Although it didn't happen on the Titanic, it is believed that on the Olympics lifeboat drill in Belfast, dated the 9th of May 1911, though this was not testing the boats, naval architect Edward Wilding would explain this evidence and how it worked in the British inquiry.
We put into one of the lifeboats on the Olympic have 100 weight review so to represent the loaded equal about 65 people. Then we raised it and lowered the boat 6 times. It was done with the object of testing with electric boat wind, not with the object that's testing the boat. I happened to see coming up one time myself, and after the weights had been removed, the boat was lowered without weights into the water, and there was nothing of the matter of her. She was watertight. I don't think there was any doubt that the boats were strong enough to be lowered, containing a full number of passengers, and I thought that the evidence of Joseph Wheat, second steward, lowered the boat about 70 in her, and it confirms our Belfast tests.
From his account, Wilding explains that although the test had been made to evaluate the winches, it proved that the lifeboats could hold a full load under the davits, lowering them from a height of about 70 feet. Of course, this would only be for the 16 regular lifeboats instead of both the regular and collapsible lifeboats. In the early morning of Wednesday the 10th of April, when the ship was in Southampton, Captain Maurice Clark of the British Board of Trade and Captain Benjamin Steele, the Marine Superintendent for the White Star Line, boarded the Titanic for one final inspection before she departed on her maiden voyage. At 8:30 a.m, 1 hour after boarding, the Titanic was streaming down the Solent between the docks and the Isle of Wight, while Clark and Steele mustered the crew before walking over to the starboard side of the ship for the lifeboat drill. The lifeboats on the port side were never used during this last known drill. During the event, 2 lifeboats were lowered in the presence of the captains, Charles Lightoller, who was then demoted to 2nd Officer, 3rd Officer Herbert Pittman, 5th Officer Harold Lowe, and 6th Officer James Moody. Nearly all seamen took part, but some were not ordered to join. The crew members who didn't join included Quartermaster Robert Hitchens and able-bodied seaman George Moore. In total, the number of participants was between 30 to 40 deck crew members. The Titanic stokers never participated, which greatly disappointed Captain Steele. How this drill worked was that 1 or 2 lifeboats would be turned out on the boat deck and would be mustered by junior officers, while senior officers would oversee the loading and lowering of the lifeboats. The crew would be instructed to put on their lifeboats on, and in each lifeboat, between 8 and 9 crew members would be on board. The boats would be then lowered into the water to see whether the davits were working, and everyone would know the drill of the lifeboat drill. No pun intended. The crew members in the lifeboats would row down the Solette with the junior officers in command in their assigned lifeboats. In this drill, lifeboat numbers 11 and 13 were used. Lifeboat 11 was commanded by Harold Lowe, while 13 was commanded by James Moody. Overseeing the loading and lowering of both lifeboats were Chief Officer Henry T. Wild and First Officer William Murdoch. Like the first 2 and following the drills that would later occur, each drill was followed under the ship's rules and uniform regulations, where crew members prepare for real-life situations if someone went overboard or if there was a collision. And like the drills in Belfast and Southampton, 1 boat on both port and starboard sides would be swung out at all times, apart from unfavourable weather. When the Titanic sailed into the open sea on Thursday the 13th of April, crew members had practiced an emergency evening drill at 6 p.m, where crew members would perform the drills with emergency lifeboats 1 and 2. But the 13th of April wasn't the only date, as the emergency lifeboat drills were held every day without fail. In these drills that would occur throughout the voyage, the emergency boat crew would be mustered under instructions that were given each morning before the drill would take place. Evening drills would last for a brief period, and like the ones before, junior officers would muster them and would take turns in shifts for the drills. According to Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, when he was questioned in the US inquiry, around 6 to 8 men, a quartermaster and 2 junior officers would be in command for each lifeboat. However, the drill didn't involve lowering lifeboats 1 and 2, but according to 4th Officer Joseph Boxall, the lifeboats had lamps where they would be lit from the beginning to the end. If they weren't lit, they would have been seen in a corner of the wheelhouse, or they would be in the lifeboats but covered with canvas. On the morning of the 14th of April, a lifeboat drill was scheduled to take place between 11 and 11:30 a.m. In the ship's galley, a notice for the lifeboat stations was pinned up, where all crew members were informed on which station they were supposed to be in the event of a fire on board, or if people needed to reach the lifeboats. Each drill would be sounded by a bugle before all stations were ready for action. But when the Titanic had entered the Labrador Current a day before, the temperature was starting to cool down. By the early morning, a strong wind had picked up, and it was then that the drill was cancelled. According to Lookout Archie Jewell, he explained that the wind was the reason, and this was proved when he was interviewed in the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry. Is it not a usual thing where there is boat practice to call to the boat deck all the men who are expected in an emergency to go with that boat?
Yes, once on a trip, once going out and once coming home, twice on a trip.
Had this been done on this trip?
No, it's generally done on the Sunday, but it was not done on that day. There was a strong wind.
Had it been all done on that day?
No, it was blowing on that day. There was a strong wind that day, and that was the reason why it was not done.
A strong wind on what day?
On the Sunday.
This meant that on every single voyage Captain Smith was on, including the Titanic, the lifeboat drills were also a custom on White Star Line vessels. The drills would occur on a Sunday morning during the voyage, and Captain Smith religiously held both fire and lifeboat drills every Sunday, but this could only happen if the weather was calm and clear, and with strong winds, lives could have been at risk and it would be dangerous to lower a few lifeboats. However, it is understood that the reason for the cancellation wasn't told to all crew members, despite the fact that all drills were for crew members only. Fireman William Taylor stated that he did not know why a lifeboat drill took place, as usually lifeboat drills on vessels would have been compulsory. Maybe the captain only told the Titanic's 6 lookouts and close crew members instead, and the others only got told about the cancellation as an announcement instead of explaining why. But despite the drills being for crew members only, a handful of first-class passengers were also aware of the situation. One passenger, Emma Buckner, would later go on to criticise the White Star Line for the cancellation and for not having any drill on board. But because most of the drills would occur at night, with the exception of the planned Sunday morning, the drills likely occurred when passengers were preparing to dine for dinner or who were inside the ship and out of sight. Later in the day, the winds had settled down and the weather was still and calm, right up until the Titanic's last moments above the North Atlantic waves. At around 6:45 p.m, lamp trimmer Samuel Hemming would place the lamps on board emergency lifeboats 1 and 2. The junior officers who were in charge were 4th Officer Boxall, who overlooked the drill while in command of lifeboat number 2 on the port side, and 3rd Officer Pittman, and either 3rd Officer Pittman or 6th Officer Moody overlooked while in command of lifeboat number 1 on the starboard side. However, there's no information on who was watching the drill from the Titanic's bridge. Hours later, the Titanic would collide with an iceberg and would sink, with only 18 lifeboats successfully launched. In the wake of the Titanic disaster, laws would be changed to ensure that there were seats for all persons on board and that the drills would be held for each voyage. Although there was one cancelled lifeboat drill, things would have been different if the Titanic never sank. Maybe a new fire and muster drill would have occurred on the morning of the 15th to make up for the cancellation, or would the Titanic have her first lifeboat drill in New York City before making her return journey to Southampton? Whatever the case may be, we now know that despite taking the drills seriously, some of the rules had cost around 1,500 lives and would change maritime history, making sure that there would be a seat for all passengers and crew on board a ship.